Thank you, Jane, and it's a pleasure to be here. Every delegate to this conference of educators knows the challenges we face as Jewish day schools in trying to manage our ever-growing budgets with diminishing resources, struggling to justify the premium of a Jewish day school education to families who are already financially stretched beyond capacity. We worry over the vicious cycle of high cost, decreasing enrollment, leading us to cut expenditures, resulting in the unavoidable lowering of the value that we offer, further impacting enrollment. Much of the conversation on the tuition crisis has revolved around budget, cost, and numbers, an important conversation to which much time and effort has been and needs to be devoted. It is my pleasure here this afternoon, together with Rabbi David Lapin and my sister Ashira, to step back from that dialogue and invite you for an hour to change the conversation from the price of a Jewish education to the value of a priceless education. Consider the idea of value. Value is created when an individual or organization offers a product or service that is in high demand and low supply. For a product to be valuable and command a premium price, it cannot be a commodity. It has to be unique. Are we offering our customers value? And at this point, let us consider our students to be our customers rather than their parents. For although their parents are paying, it is our students whom we are serving. So to test the value of our offering to our customers, we've asked a wide spectrum of high school teachers whether they believe that given the choice, their students would stay in their classrooms rather than go elsewhere to do something that they perceive to be more valuable. Nearly all answered that their students would not be in the classroom if they were not compelled to do so. This makes the task of the teacher almost untenable. Teachers need to hold the attention of an audience that does not want to be there. Moreover, students and teachers know that students could access online the same information being taught in the classroom, free, quicker, in their own time and place, and often taught by international experts and some of the world's best teachers. How does a teacher compete with that? And how does a school justify its cost in such a hyper-connected environment? Add to this the fact that in the world in which we live, anything that is relevant today is less relevant tomorrow. Certainly, what was valuable to students 5 years ago is less valuable today. Yet many teachers are teaching much the same content today and in much the same ways as they did a few years ago. If we are to be perceived to be adding true value, we cannot afford for our improvements to be incremental, but rather they must be transformative. Furthermore, for the first time in history, we face a generation that in many important areas knows more than its teachers and parents. Their natural affinity with digital thinking often gives them insurmountable advantages over their teachers who they know are digitally challenged. We're going to term this generation the unteachable generation because they are unteachable using conventional approaches and methods. The reason? As Mark Perensky terms it, they are digital natives and we are digital immigrants. It is challenging for an immigrant to teach an adopted language to students for whom it is their mother tongue. This is what we are attempting to do, and they know it. We suggest that there are 7 critical ways in which digital natives learn and think differently from their digital immigrant parents and teachers. Digital natives think digitally, not analog. They hyperlink, naturally integrating concepts from different disciplines. They have access to information instantly, anywhere. Digital natives multitask using multiple parallel cognitive tracks. They learn collaboratively rather than individually. Digital natives are global thinkers who see global possibilities and are not inhibited by local boundaries. Lastly, digital natives require instant gratification and frequent reward. To a generation that thinks and learns in these ways, much of our conventional educational methodology becomes obsolete. But this, ladies and gentlemen, offers Jewish day schools the biggest opportunity they have ever had to differentiate themselves in a way that other schools cannot, changing the conversation from the price of a Jewish education to the value of a priceless education. With this opportunity, we believe we can transform the vicious cycle of cost escalation to the virtuous cycle of value elevation. Rabbi David Lapin will present what he believes to be the strategic distinction of Jewish day schools. During the lab time, you will all engage firsthand in the experience behind our value proposition, after which we will come back together to debrief the experience and draw outcomes. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Rabbi David Lapin.
Thank you, Bruria, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Wonderful to be with you. Can you hear me at the back, or do I need a mic? When I work with leaders of corporations, I tend to talk to them about the importance of utilizing their innate strengths to build their competitive advantage. As a Jewish people, we have some innate strengths as well. And we can draw on those innate strengths to build what we call a Jewish advantage. A Jewish advantage manifests in a variety of different metrics. Perhaps the most well-known is the astonishingly disproportionate number of Nobel Prize winners that are Jewish. Out of over 850 prize winners, more than 22% are Jewish, although only 0.2% of the world population is Jewish. Only 0.17% of the American population is Jewish. That's a statistic that causes some people pride and others discomfort, but it is a data point. And when Richard Dawkins, notorious for his atheism and anti-Semitism, was asked to what he attributes this disproportionately high ratio of Jewish Nobel Prize winners, he said, "I don't know. But I don't think it's a minor thing. It's colossal." That's not our only Jewish advantages. There are many ways in which to perceive it, and I'm convinced that any such distinction has nothing to do with anything genetic or any superior Jewish intellect. It might be due to many factors, but one of them, I believe, is an intellectual methodology that we've cultivated over centuries. A way of thinking about anything. We tend to apply that methodology to whatever subject or topic it is that we're choosing to study. It's a methodology that I would suggest is well documented in between the lines of the Talmud. And I'm here, ladies and gentlemen, to plead with you to consider bringing the teaching of Talmud into the center stage offering of Jewish education. Not for its content, although its content is glorious, but not for its content. I'm suggesting that we make Talmud the centerpiece of Jewish education because of the intellectual methodology it teaches and of its capacity to help students develop and maintain that Jewish advantage in the way they think. Now, this idea that there is a Jewish way of thinking and that it's documented in the pages of the Talmud, and by the way, that doesn't mean that every Nobel Prize winner studied Talmud. We know that's not true. The Jewish way of thinking is widespread. We experience it every Pesach in the Seder. The Seder is constructed using a very uniquely Jewish way of thinking. And we'll talk about that a little later. I'm not suggesting that only people who study Talmud win Nobel Prizes, not true. But the Talmud happens to document the indigenous Jewish intellectual methodology that is available to anybody. And the thesis isn't even my own. UK government advisor of South Korea and fellow of Balliol College, Professor Dennis Noble, confirms that in every Korean home there is a copy of the Talmud. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I would suspect that there are homes of people in this room who do not have a copy of the Talmud. But in every Korean home there's a copy of the Talmud, which he says they called Talmudu. And they study it. And the reason they study it, says South Korean representative of Oxford University and professor at Seoul National University, Professor Sung-hee Kim, is that Koreans have noticed the disproportionately high percentage of Jewish winners of Nobel Prizes. They're conscious of the Jewish advantage. They're conscious of the fact that we apply a certain way of thinking to anything we study. And that gives us a certain dimension which they would like to emulate. And their research took them back to the Talmud as the only place where the methodology is documented. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we find the Koreans, among others, are studying our Talmud so as to learn how to think in an indigenously Jewish way, not an exclusively Jewish way. Anybody can think that way. It's just that we've done so for many hundreds of years, so it comes naturally to us, but we can teach it to anybody. They're studying Talmud. And in some of our Jewish day schools, we're not. That raises some serious questions about what we're doing. We have this access to a Jewish intellectual methodology that we know works, and we're denying it to our students. Why would we do that? The problem is a little bit more complicated than that. For not only are we abandoning this Jewish legacy methodology of thinking in our general studies, because I would suggest we could use this legacy methodology of thinking in the way we teach everything. And that would be our competitive advantage. That would be our value proposition. And not only aren't we using it in the teaching of general studies, ladies and gentlemen, but we're modifying the Talmud to fit in with Western linear thinking, simplifying it, and creating linear structures, incremental structures, to help the student understand the Talmud when we do teach it, rather than helping to mold the student's mind from a purely linear way of thinking to what I like to call a spherical way of thinking, where you start with an idea at the core, and then you move in 360 degrees simultaneously, exploring the implications of that idea in multiple directions. Western education is analog. It's linear. You can't get to 3 without passing 1 and 2. But that's not how digital natives work, and that's not how the Talmud works. In the Talmud, aligned with a digital native, you can jump from 1 directly to 3 without passing 2 on the way. You can jump to infinity if you want to. by a method of hyperlinking, which we're going to demonstrate to you. Western thinking is often occurs in solitude. Think library. Talmud thinking occurs collaboratively. Think Beit HaMedrash. What is more aligned and congruent with the digital native? Learning in solitude or learning in collaboration? Clearly learning in collaboration. And Western thinking is generally focused on a single intellectual mental track. Whereas in the Talmud, like with digital natives, often the thinking is simultaneously carried out in multiple mental frameworks and tracks. And that keeps the mind occupied in all those different tracks simultaneously. If we were to begin to teach our legacy methodology in our day schools, if we were to begin to unpack that method, how do Jews think that has given them some kind of an advantage? What is there about the way we approach a problem, the way we solve a problem, the way we understand a difficult issue? Is there something that comes naturally to us? Is there something we can naturally and easily be particularly good at? And let's try and utilize that in our various different subjects that we teach. Then we would be changing the conversation from the price of education to the value of a priceless education. Because we would be able to give students what they need most. Now consider, ladies and gentlemen, for a moment, what do our students need most from us? As Bruria mentioned earlier, whatever we're teaching them, they can access online quicker, easier, cheaper, and sometimes better. So what can we teach them that they cannot access online and cannot get in other school systems? And you may be a little surprised at the answer I'm going to suggest to you. I'm going to suggest that what students need most of all, and some of them are already thinking this way, is the capacity in the future to compete with robots. Only last week in the Wall Street Journal, Bill Gates was quoted as saying, "Automation threatens all manner of workers, from drivers to waiters to nurses. I don't think people have that in their mental model." And in the same article, a set of researchers from MIT were quoted as saying that within 10 years, 50% of current jobs will be automated. And if there's anything our students need from us, it's to be able to do what robots cannot, to be able to do what robots never will be able to. They're not worried about competing with their friends and colleagues and peers. That's yesterday's worry. They're worried about competing with technology. And so we need to ask ourselves, how well are we equipping them? Just consider for a moment, 5-year-old Uber, disintermediating the entire taxi industry in many large cities. But go a little further, and Travis Kalanick, the CEO of Uber, is collaborating with Google on driverless cars because he believes when he will be able to dispatch driverless cars to you, you won't own a car. It will be so cheap to call an Uber whenever you want it that you won't possess a car. They're thinking that already. They're planning that already. The students in your classroom know that already. And imagine what that does to the socio-economic environment. So what is it that we can do that robots cannot? Firstly, robots can learn. Artificial intelligence is enabling technology to learn, and to learn fast, and to adapt. But robots cannot think creatively. Robots can serve, but robots cannot care. Robots can communicate, but robots cannot inspire. And so teachers should be checking in with themselves every day, in every lesson. Am I enabling the students I'm teaching to care for others? Because that robots can't do. Am I teaching students how to inspire others? Because that robots can't do. Am I teaching students to think creatively? See, learning is a natural function of any living organism. If you don't learn, you can't survive. A plant learns, an animal learns, humans learn, it's instinctual. But creative thinking is not. And creative thinking starts with the art of questioning. Creative thinking starts with challenging existing paradigms. When you're able to reject what is before you and seek for an alternative, that's when creative thinking begins. And the Talmud is all about questioning. We question each other in the Talmud. We question other generations in the Talmud. We question the Mishnah. We question the Bible, the Tanakh. We question God himself. We question everything. That's Talmudic methodology. I'll never forget my entrance exam into yeshiva I desperately wanted to study, and I prepared the passage I was supposed to prepare, hired tutors and mentors. I was ready for any question that could possibly be thrown at me. I had the answer to everything. And I walked into the study of my Rosh Yeshiva, and it remains clear in my mind as if it was today. And I sat down with that cocky arrogance of a young student well prepared for an exam. And he said to me, opening the book,
lots of very engaging conversations going on. I'm so pleased to see that. If we had 1,000 people sitting in this room spending approximately 20 minutes learning, that's about 300 and something minutes. If we were lawyers, we would have billed that time at close to $20,000 the last 20 minutes. But we're educators. And I would argue that the value of that time is pretty priceless. So I think, Jane, it was a good experiment. It was great to see the engagement going on in this room. I'm going to begin by unpacking some of the Talmud piece that was in front of you and linking some of the connections that we can make from the Talmud to some of the conversations that we were having before. Hopefully, a lot of what I'm going to say you found, discovered between you. There's no single right answer or way to approach this. We suggested 7 critical ways in which digital natives think and learn differently from their digital immigrant parents and teachers. And we suggested that the Talmud holds the methodology that addresses those needs and even more, uses those needs as a distinct advantage. We said that digital natives think digitally, not analog. Did you notice that the Mishnah starts with a question? No introduction, no background, no explanation. It just dives in with a question. Kind of like a Google search. The discussion is framed using keywords. You'll notice that the text is not linear. It's synthesizing different concepts, different conversations from different places. You'll see words like Kriyat Shema linked with the ceremonies of the Kohanim and with the processes that happened in the Beit HaMikdash. This method is forcing an engagement with the text because it's not obvious and it doesn't make sense. We're actively having to work to figure it out as opposed to passively listening to content that's presented to us. You'll also notice that the Mishnah assumes a whole bunch of prior knowledge. It assumes that we understand that there's an obligation to say Shema. it assumes that we already know the concepts of the Kohanim and when they were allowed to eat their terumah. Is this not the conversation of a flipped classroom, where the students go home and acquire the knowledge that they need to be able to come in and work through an engaged, facilitated conversation with their teachers? The second thing that we talked about was hyperlinking. I think that one was probably an easy one for you to spot, because it continues connecting disparate pieces of information. It introduces different texts, goes right back to the Chumash, and it talks about the creation, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker, and it connects pieces of the Shema, V'shach b'chov kumecha, together with the concept of Kohanim and Terumah and Kriya Shema. It references this content without any definition. It assumes that you know, and if you don't, you can go back to the source and find it out for yourself. It contrasts abstract and applies that to logical and practical. It takes spiritual and physical. It's kind of the ultimate and integrated curriculum. We talked about the access of information instantly and the ability to get it from anywhere. This piece has created thinking and engagement with the teacher by assuming that prior knowledge, creating a framework for a discussion by choosing relevant pieces of information to connect, and then allowing that conversation to happen by question and answer, question and more question. Here we understand very clearly that the student has enough prior knowledge to engage in a very intelligent, sophisticated, and complicated dialogue with the teacher or with another student. We talked about multitasking and parallel thinking, where students have the ability, well or not well, to do many things at the same time. Here we're asking them to engage in texts from different eras, in different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, they may be using English as their mother tongue. We're connecting the Chumash, the Mishnah, the Gemara. We're presenting multiple viewpoints, conflicting viewpoints, and we're not giving them easy answers. We're not even giving them a single answer. And they're continuing to drive these parallel tracks in their head all through the conversation. It's the most internet-like text we have. Learning collaboratively rather than learning as an individual. Well, you saw that happen in this room. But the text becomes a point of collaborative engagement. It's almost impossible to study on your own. It also forces the engagement in the same way that the structure of our Seder does, where it asks questions and answers questions with more questions, and each layer of questioning gives you an insight that's a bit deeper than the insight that you had before. There's the process of Socratic questioning, where the questioning is actually guiding you towards a solution. There's a constant shifting of focus, referring back to concepts that it raised in the beginning and adding something new, tying them back together again. We talked about global thinkers, students that are not limited by their local boundaries. The ability to think in patterns, to see this as a vast body of work, to reference things from all over the place, to engage with concepts from different time and different space. Even to understand the concept that time isn't time the same way in different places at different times of the year. We introduced the concept of chatzot and alot hashachar, and an hour in a day. An hour in Jewish law is different periods of time at different times of the year. And the students can understand that when it says chatzot, it doesn't mean 12 a.m. midnight. And what my chatzot is might be different than what it is for a different student in a different time zone or a different location in the world. And they're able to make practices from ancient times, things that are abstract or difficult for them to relate to, relevant to modern application. And the last thing we mentioned was the need for instant gratification and frequent reward. And because of the modular technique, where the content is modular, it's in small pieces, you deal with one question, you unravel that, you move to the next one, it's quite exhilarating when you go, aha, I get what he's saying. There's a logical structure, so it's not overwhelming. And the wisdom that can be brought out from small pieces of content is quite rewarding. They're also able to see how to extract large amounts of information out of few words and learn the reverse, to be able to summarize big concepts with small words. There's a whole other layer to what happens in the Gemara. I'm going to refer back to the master, to my father, who can help us apply some of the life concepts that we can get out of this text.
So let's look at some of the relevance of all this to the students that we're teaching. Bear in mind also that in a classical yeshiva environment, the classroom occupies about 10% of the studying time. So for 90% of the time, they're studying collaboratively. Only for 10% of the time are they studying with a teacher. That's quite interesting. Let's start with the topic. What was the topic of this little piece that you studied? How many people felt the topic was the mitzvah of saying the Shema? Nobody? Some people. How many people thought the topic was the belief in God and a declaration of our belief in God? Okay. How many people thought that the topic was the unique Jewish philosophy of time? Great. Wonderful. The Torah is one of the only philosophies that sees the start of the day at night. And we're going to understand why that's so critically important to your students. Firstly, the Mishnah starts with a question. From when do you say the Shema? Why does it start with that question? Why does the Talmud start with this? Why does the Talmud, which is the entire body of Jewish thinking at that time, law, ethics, philosophy, halakha, everything, why does it start with this Mishnah? And a child might ask that, or you might set a student up to ask that question. The answer is, the Talmud starts with the first activity of the day. What is the first thing you do in the day? And of course, a student is going to say, this isn't talking about the beginning of the day, it's talking about the nighttime Shema, which leads us right into the question of, that's when the Jewish day starts. Why is that so crucial? Because now consider for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, what that says about sleep. Is sleep a recovery from an exhausted day, or is sleep a preparation for a fresh tomorrow? And think of the difference in quality of sleep and how you wake up, and I invite you to try it tonight. Try going to sleep and the last thing on your mind being, my day is over. This is already tomorrow. I'm starting my next day. And the first thing I do for tomorrow is I rest. I take some time out. I dream. I vision. I become creative. That's how I start my day. When I get up in the morning, I'm halfway through my day already, and my subconscious has been working all night. And I'm ready to start with creative engagement. The idea of a moment in time, the idea that there's some degree of timing of events, that there are some things which if you do them too early, they don't count, and if you do them too late, they don't count. That's a conversation in the classroom. If you say Shema before the time, Doesn't work. You say Shema after the time, it doesn't work. What other things in life are tied to a specific time and lose their validity if carried out too early or too late? An interesting conversation on time management and self-discipline. And then you're transported to another era where you're talking about the time of the temple, our history, laws, culture, the eating of truma and why that was important, and the agricultural laws of truma and what they are. Another conversation takes place. Parallel tracks. And then we come into an idea of spiritual chemistry. That there's a change of status. One can change one's status spiritually. One can become mentally contaminated. One can become emotionally contaminated. One can become socially contaminated. You've often heard of the phrase toxic environments, toxic friendships, toxic thoughts. There is such an idea, and it's in this Mishnah. And there's a way to cleanse oneself from that. And part of the cleansing requires preparation, change of mindset, and waiting for a new dawn, for a new day, and to start the new day in a different mindset. An opportunity to discuss the mastery of toxicity, how to master toxicity and purify oneself from it. And then we go into natural versus artificial time. The idea Ashira mentioned, an hour in the Talmud is not 60 minutes. An hour is a 12th of the time between sunrise and sunset. And now you can ask the students in the class, how long is an hour in Philadelphia right now? How many minutes is a halachic hour? And how many minutes is a halachic hour today in Sydney, Australia? And they have to get onto the internet and they have to find out what time sunrise is and what time sunset is, and they have to do some calculation. And what about on the 24th of November? What would the length of an hour be in Moscow? And how does that affect the way synchronicity happens around the world? A little bit of geography, a little bit of math, a little bit of science. And then the story of Rabbi Gamliel and his sons. And the sons come back from a wedding and they say, Father, we haven't said Shema yet. They probably came back, it was the early hours of the morning, because he said you can say it until the morning. They come back from this wedding in the early hours of the morning and they say, Father, we haven't said the Shema. Notice, he doesn't say to them, I can't believe you. My children would have gone through the night without saying the Shema. Couldn't you stop for a moment and say the Shema? He doesn't say that. He says, no problem. You can say it now. So he endorses the fact they didn't say the Shema, because there's a time not to multitask. There's a time to be present. You're at a wedding. You're at a social occasion. Don't be thinking about Shema. Be thinking about rejoicing with the bride and groom and their families. Be present. You'll see in many weddings today, minyanim gathering all over the place. Ma'ariv, Ma'ariv, Ma'ariv. Have you ever seen that? People gathering to daven Ma'ariv. Didn't happen there. Be focused and present. When you're with somebody in a moment of celebration, don't be thinking about davening. Don't be thinking about prayer. Be present in that moment. So we have a chance to talk about presence. We have a chance to talk about when to be focused and when to multitask, and to be able to master that switch, to know which is which and when to do it. And finally, the sense of artificial deadlines. Even though you've got till the morning, set your deadline as midnight. Set your deadline before the natural deadline. Because of human nature, we tend to procrastinate. It's normal. It's natural. There's a whole conversation on procrastination and on time management and on self-discipline. Ladies and gentlemen, the Mishnah could be a topic of conversation in a classroom for hours and hours, for weeks of conversation. But what's important again is not so much the content of this particular Mishnah, as fascinating as it is, it's the methodology. It's the way the Talmudic system works, the way Talmudic intellectual methodology works, and why that gives us an advantage, particularly in the digital age. I would argue that the Talmud has never been more relevant than it is today in the digital age. Interestingly, that when shortly before his death, Einstein was asked what he would do differently if he could live his life again, he replied without hesitation, "I would study the Talmud." And once again, I ask us to ask ourselves, what right do we have to withhold that intellectual methodology from our next generation, who have to struggle to compete with robots, to think creatively, to question, to challenge paradigms and assumptions? Now would I wonder how it would be. We sent around an interesting questionnaire on the website. Many of you took the trouble to answer it. Thank you very much. And your answers were intriguing and original and rich. We asked, how do you justify the cost of education? When a parent says to you, why should I make this sacrifice, stretch myself to these limits to send my child to your school? What is the answer you give? And you gave wonderful answers. They were not generic answers. They were well thought out answers. But how would it be, ladies and gentlemen, if we could give the following answer? Send your child to our school because using our authentic legacy methodology, we prepare our students to compete in the digital age. That's what we do. Yes, we use the Talmud as a vehicle. We use math as a vehicle. We use science, physics, and chemistry as a vehicle. We use literature as a vehicle. But students don't need to learn content from us. They can get content online. We're using this as a vehicle to help students learn how to inspire others, not just communicate. To help students learn how to care for others, not merely serve others. And to help students think creatively and question, not merely learn and answer. And so what is one of the unique value propositions of a priceless education? That using our authentic legacy methodology, using a way of thinking that is indigenous to us, natural to us, comes easily, we prepare our students to compete in the digital age. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your willingness to participate and come along with us. And we hope that this triggers some interesting discussion and conversation and perhaps takes you into some new realms of experimentation and trial. Thank you once again.